Hello, and welcome to the Current Science and Technology podcast from the Museum of Science in Boston. I'm your host, Susan Heilman, and every week we bring you interviews with guest researchers and our museum staff covering science and technology in depth. I have with me Dr. Joel Therrien, a physicist, sometimes pretending to be an engineer, at the Center for High-rate Nanomanufacturing at UMass Lowell. Hi, Dr. Therrien. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks.
So the title of the talk you gave today was the Nanocanary. And so we're going to talk about what that reference means and then how you're using it to help the human body.
All right, well, the reference comes from way back when they were doing mining, and they used canaries in coal mines. And the idea was that, when you're down in a mine, you can't see the invisible gases that are down there, and the canary is going to become susceptible to those gases more rapidly than a person would. And being brightly colored in the background of a coal mine, it's very easy for the miners to look up and see. So if they see that the canary is still happily singing away in the cage, then they know everything's okay. But if the canary's down on the bottom of the cage dead, then they know that they better get out of there. That's where the reference for the canary came from. The nano aspect of it, we can take two different ways to describe that. One is that we're now using single cells as a sensor instead of an entire animal, so it's much smaller. And it's also taken on a focus towards testing nanomaterials, among other things. So in two different ways, it kind of qualifies as a nano-canary.
So basically, you want to use cells as an early detection system, but what are the cells detecting? Do you want to use one certain type of cell to detect this poison or this disease or that disease?
Well, actually, as a matter of fact, the way that this sensor works is that it's unique in that it's non-specific. When it comes to a biosensor, a lot of times your interest is in finding something that's toxic. And so in this particular case, we're about as close as you can get to something that directly senses toxicity, because we use the behavior of living cells and their reaction to their environment as a means of detecting whether or not there's something dangerous. If the toxin is present, the cell is going to react to this, and we can see unique responses within our sensor that tell us that something is wrong with the cell.
So what are some of the things that would happen to a cell when a toxin was present?
Well, what we're detecting is actually changes in its mechanical properties. Cells will react to their environment in multiple ways. One of the ways that's actually very easy for you to see by a microscope is they change their shape. When cells become stressed, they tend to round up. When they're happy with their environment, most often cases, if they're on a surface, they'll flatten out and kind of grab onto the surface. They can also change their internal structures. There's all these networks of fibers within the cell that actually determine its structural rigidity. And what happens with these cells actually is that they will very dynamically, within a few minutes, be able to dissolve or rebuild these structures to suit the needs of what the cell has at that moment. And so all of these are mechanical signatures that get imprinted on the way that we read out the properties of the cell. And so we actually will end up seeing changes in two key parameters on our sensor that give us an indication that the cell is doing something.
And what is the sensor that you're working with?
The sensor that we're working with uses a quartz crystal. So quartz is a piezoelectric material, and what this means is that when you squeeze it, it produces a voltage, or if you apply a voltage to it, it changes its shape. And, anyone who has a quartz watch actually has exactly that inside the watch. There's this little piece of quartz that oscillates back and forth, generating these voltage pulses about 32,000 times a second.
Wow. That
then are basically counted up, and when enough have happened, you know that 1 second has passed. In our particular case, we use a quartz that's this flat disc with metal electrodes on the two flat surfaces of it. This particular one oscillates back and forth at 10 megahertz, so 10 million times a second.
Wow.
And now what we do is we let the cells land on and basically live on the surface of this crystal. And as they change their shape as well as their internal structures in reaction to the environment, what's going to happen is that is going to impart on the crystal itself. These crystals are extremely sensitive to additions of mass. I mean, I can take these crystals and literally just breathe on it, and the thin layer of water vapor will change the frequency on it. So in this particular case, The cell structural shape determines how much of its mass is closely and intimately coupled to the crystal. And then the internal structures determine basically what we call the viscoelastic properties. So how hard or how soft the cell is, which determines how much energy it takes in order to be able to shake the cell back and forth with the crystal.
Okay, so let's break these down a little bit. So there's two main things that you're looking for. One is how much of the cell is touching the surface. That's kind of connected to the mass in this case. And the other is how soft or flexible versus how rigid the cell is.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so the first one that we mentioned is the amount that the cell, like the surface area, the amount of the cell that touches
that would be a good way to describe it.
Okay, that the amount of that, the more surface area that's touching it, the more it's affecting the quartz crystal.
Right.
And that's going to cause either more or less vibrations per second.
Exactly. Yeah, it'll either speed up or slow down the oscillations of the crystal.
Okay, and then the other one is how soft versus rigid the cell is. And how does that translate with the quartz crystal?
Well, we have to electrically drive the crystal to make it oscillate back and forth. And within the system that drives this, it monitors how much the crystal is oscillating by. So it actually tells us, if the crystal isn't oscillating very much, then we know that what we refer to as the impedance is high. So in other words, it's taking more energy to get an oscillation going. And if we find that the amplitude of oscillation is very high, then we know that the impedance is low, the cell is stiffer, and it's taking less energy to get it to oscillate.
Okay, so if you have something, kind of jiggly
go
on the top of it, so a jiggly, soft, mushy cell, it's going to require more energy to keep the oscillations the same.
Exactly.
And then you measure how much energy you're putting in. Like, oh, there's more energy going in. That must mean that the cell is softer.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. So what do you then do with this information? Let's say you have a cell that is it normally going to be rounded and soft, and that means something in particular, that the cell is either healthy or not healthy?
For one thing, that will be determined by the type of cell, because each type of cell is going to have a reaction in its own way. It also is going to depend on the particular toxin. As of right now, we can't really use this sensor directly as basically giving us all the information. But what we do is we use this coupled with other things such as microscopy, as well as some knowledge about what types of materials we're using to get some ideas of what the reactions we expect to see. I'll give you an example of where there's some synergy between this sensor versus the microscopy techniques that have existed for hundreds of years now. When a biologist wants to look at cells that they've treated with something, unless they have some advanced knowledge about the mechanics of how it's going to happen, they're going to pick time points that they're going to look at, because it's labor-intensive to do this. So obviously one doesn't want to do this every second or every minute. So they might pick 12 hours, 24 hours. I mean, in many ways, it's going to be determined by the convenience of the researcher.
Right.
In this particular case, that misses out on a lot of dynamics that can be happening. We've got an example of one thing that we tried using recently, where we took cells and exposed them to a material called sodium azide. Sodium azide is what's referred to as a mitochondrial poison. And the amazing thing about it was, within a few minutes of adding this in, we saw a very large and very rapid change in the frequency in our sensor. And then 15 minutes later, it was gone. So if you had waited 24 hours, you never would have saw it. And that actually allowed us to go back and guide the microscopy. We told the microscopist, take this at 8 minutes, take this at 15 minutes. And you could literally see a change in the mitochondria that lasted a few minutes and then disappeared.
Oh, interesting. So in the very beginning, you mentioned that another reason why this can be called a nano-canary is that you're using this canary, this testing on nanoparticles.
Right.
So if you want to spend a few minutes talking about how you've tested nanoparticles.
Absolutely. We've tested a few different nanomaterials, and this is actually under funding from the National Science Foundation, We've tested carbon nanotubes. They're a very popular material. In fact, from a nano perspective, they're probably one of the ones that are in most production. But there's a lot of concern about the fact that carbon nanotubes actually have a lot of qualities that is similar to asbestos.
Which is something that is not healthy for our cells.
And the mode of action is actually very similar because asbestos is a long, fibrous, inorganic material that what happens is when you breathe it in, inside your lungs, there are these cells called macrophages. And these macrophages are basically the garbage collectors in your lungs. They exist in the rest of your body too, but we'll focus on the ones in the lungs. And, an analogy I always give people is, when was the last time you cleaned under your bed? And, there's dust bunnies under there.
Yeah.
Have you ever wondered why you don't have dust bunnies in your lungs?
And that's the macrophages.
And the macrophages are cleaning that up. But the problem, though, is that the macrophages are kind of like your standard bouncer. They're just going to go after anything that shows up. So the difficulty with this is that they're not equipped to handle these inorganic materials. And worse yet, these long fibrous materials, what the macrophage actually does is it comes over and envelops it. And it tries to swallow it, and the sharp ends literally poke through the cell and burst it. And this is bad news because these cells are equipped with all of these very strong enzymes designed for breaking down and destroying other materials.
Oh, so now that gets released.
Now it gets spilled all over the lungs, and that's what ends up leading to mesothelioma. And the concern is that the carbon nanotubes have two things going for them. First off, structurally, they look a lot like asbestos. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that in order to grow these, they actually have to use a lot of very toxic metals, such as cadmium. And so there's actually debate as to which is worse. Is it the shape or is it the chemistry of the nanotubes that's a concern? So we've been able to take these macrophages, let them settle down on top of one of our sensors, and then feed them carbon nanotubes. And we're able to see at low concentrations the carbon nanotubes are collected and the cells survive. But at high concentrations, they're going to die. And we see a difference in the reaction, how the frequency changes, how the impedance changes. That tells us at what threshold is that going to happen.
So it's a really good way of testing the nanoparticles, and in a very short time frame, like you mentioned before as well.
Well, there's actually an additional aspect to it that almost no other type of assay could do, which is we don't have to kill the cells in the process.
Right.
When you're doing the microscopy, you have to fix and stain, which basically means dye them and kill them.
Right.
So you can't look at real-time behavior.
Changes, right.
So here's a question. Most people, if somebody's working in a factory with carbon nanotubes, they're not going to get exposed to just one massive dose. They're going to get exposed to small doses over time. So what happens when you have repeat doses?
Right, and so now you can test small doses over a period of time and see where that threshold is.
Exactly, and we can see whether, say, 2 doses that are small are worse than 1 dose that's large.
So that's a very interesting use of the nano-canary in this case, testing nano things using things on the nano scale.
Yes.
So what's next for your quartz crystal nano-canary?
Well, we've got several different areas that we're doing research on, and one of them actually has a potential commercial application. I was mentioning that's generally there for measuring toxicity, and although we've talked so far about toxicity that we want to avoid, there's a type of toxicity that we actually are interested in, which is using chemotherapies. Because there's a case where you want the toxicity. You obviously only want it for the cancer cells, but you want to kill those cells. And what might be surprising to people is that not every single person reacts to any one chemotherapy well. And so the doctors actually have no real way of knowing in advance what's going to work and what won't.
Right, they just kind of throw it in there and see what happens.
There's obviously some decisions in this, but a lot of it is still guesswork for the fact that you just don't know.
So this sounds like a precursor then to something like personalized medicine.
It's exactly for personalized medicine. So in fact, we have done some pilot studies using actual biopsies from cancer patients and done tests, and we are actually right now looking at trying to get this commercialized and try to see either if there's a company that's interested in acquiring the technology or if we're going to start something ourselves.
Right, so you could actually take a biopsy, a small amount of cancer cells, stick them on your sensor, and then add a drug to it and see if that drug does in fact kill the cell.
Exactly. and certainly save months of pain and suffering for
right,
cancer patients.
testing from it. It's like, oh, well, this isn't going to work, then why bother trying it in the first place?
Exactly.
Or this is going to work, or you could even get dosage maybe from
right, dosage
from doing
is one
this.
thing. And if you think about it from the perspective of the patient, those few months the cancer might continue to grow. So
right.
that's time is really ticking on there. From another perspective, well, a lot of people don't realize is just how expensive it is for these drugs. They don't have to bear the brunt of it, but the insurance companies do. And
right.
I've heard it can be up to $10,000 to $20,000 per month.
Per person.
Per person, yes.
Well, that's a really fascinating application for this that I didn't even think of, oh, is this cell being poisoned, that cell not being poisoned, but to actually use it for cancer treatment. And getting dosage and personalized medicine. That's really, really useful. And so I wish you a lot of luck with getting that commercialized in some way, because it sounds really promising.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you very much for speaking with me today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
That's it for this week's show, but be sure to come back next time for more of the latest in science and technology. This podcast is a production of Current Science and Technology at the Museum of Science in Boston, part of the Boston community for over 175 years. For more information, visit our website at www.mos.org/CST or email us at podcast@mos.org. Thanks for listening.